I came back from a business trip and found my things thrown all over the yard. My daughter yelled, "Clean up this trash. I need the room for my yoga." I looked her straight in the eyes and said, "Then clear out your own room, because this house is mine." She froze. It was time to show who's in charge. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Nellie, and at 65 years old, I thought I had seen every possible way a daughter could break her mother's heart. I was wrong. The rental car's engine was still ticking as I stepped onto my own driveway, exhaustion weighing heavy on my shoulders after 3 days of business meetings in Chicago. The house looked different somehow, darker, more unwelcoming than the warm home I'd left behind. But it wasn't until I rounded the corner toward the front door that I saw them. My belongings, scattered across the front yard like garbage after a storm. My favorite reading chair sat crooked near the mailbox, its burgundy fabric stained with morning dew. Photo albums lay splayed open, precious memories exposed to the elements. Clothes I'd folded carefully just days before were now draped over bushes like abandoned rags. My mother's china, the delicate blue and white set she'd passed down to me before her death, lay partially unpacked near the driveway, some pieces already showing chips from careless handling. I stood there frozen, my overnight bag slipping from numb fingers. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of mistake, maybe a burglary gone wrong. But then I heard her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Finally, you're back. Now clean up this trash. I need that room cleared out by noon." Thalia emerged from the house wearing designer yoga pants that cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget, and a tank top that showed off the expensive personal trainer sessions I'd been paying for. At 35, my daughter had perfected the art of looking effortlessly beautiful while delivering maximum cruelty. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect ponytail, not a strand out of place, and her makeup was already flawless despite the early hour. "Thalia," I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. "What is this? What happened to my things?" She rolled her eyes, that same exaggerated gesture she'd been using since she was 13. "Nothing happened to them. I moved them out. I told you last week I was converting your bedroom into a meditation and yoga space. You obviously weren't listening. I searched my memory desperately. No such conversation had ever taken place. You never said anything about, God, Mom, your memory is getting worse by the day." She cut me off with a dismissive wave. "I specifically told you I needed more space for my wellness routine. The guest room is perfectly fine for you. You're hardly ever here anyway with all your little work trips." Little work trips. She said it like I was gallivanting around the country for pleasure instead of working to maintain the home she lived in rent-free, the car she drove without making payments, the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to without ever asking what it cost. "But my things," I said, gesturing weakly toward the chaos spread across the lawn. "My mother's china, the photos, are perfectly fine. Stop being so dramatic." Thalia checked her phone, clearly bored with the conversation. "Ashley and Madison are coming over at 11 for our yoga session, so I need this mess cleaned up before then. I can't have my friends seeing this disaster." The casual cruelty in her tone hit me like a physical blow. I looked around at my life scattered across the grass, 40 years of memories, treasures, and personal belongings reduced to an embarrassing mess that might inconvenience her social schedule. "Thalia, please, some of these things are irreplaceable. The photo albums, my mother's dishes. Then you should have been more careful with them instead of hoarding so much junk." She was scrolling through her phone now, not even bothering to look at me. "Honestly, Mom, you're like one of those hoarder people on TV. It's embarrassing. Hoarder people." I thought about my modest bedroom, the room I'd given up when she moved back in, temporarily 3 years ago. A few books on the nightstand, some family photos, my mother's jewelry box, a comfortable reading chair by the window. Hardly the stuff of reality TV interventions. Where am I supposed to sleep tonight? The question came out smaller than I intended, like a child asking permission. "The guest room, obviously. I already told you that." She finally looked up from her phone, and there was something cold in her green eyes, something that made my stomach turn. "You act like it's the end of the world. It's just a room change. You'll survive. Just a room change." As if she were rearranging furniture instead of displacing her own mother from the bedroom she'd occupied for 15 years. The room where I'd cried myself to sleep after her father died, where I'd planned and worried and dreamed about giving her the best life possible. But my things will go wherever they fit. What doesn't fit gets donated or thrown away. I'm not running a storage facility here. Thalia's voice was getting sharper now, impatient. "Look, I don't have time for this drama. I have an important conference call in 20 minutes, then yoga with the girls, then lunch with Derek." Derek, the latest in a string of men she'd been dating, each one lasting just long enough to buy her expensive dinners and weekend trips before she grew bored and moved on. I'd learned not to bother learning their names anymore. "Now, are you going to clean this up? Or do I need to call someone to haul it all away?" She was already walking back toward the house, dismissing me like hired help who'd disappointed her. I stood there in my own driveway, surrounded by the debris of my life, watching my daughter disappear into the house without a backward glance. Neighbors were starting to emerge for their morning routines. Mrs. Patterson retrieving her newspaper, the young couple from next door loading their baby into the car for daycare. They all looked at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity, but no one approached. No one offered to help. The humiliation burned in my chest like acid. This was my house. My name was on the deed, on the mortgage I'd been paying faithfully for 22 years. Yet here I was, being treated like an inconvenient tenant who'd overstayed her welcome. I bent down and picked up one of the photo albums, brushing dirt from its cover. The plastic sleeve was cracked, and some of the pictures had come loose. Photos of Thalia's childhood, birthday parties I'd thrown, school plays I'd attended, family vacations I'd saved for months to afford. All of it now deemed junk worthy of the front lawn. As I knelt there among my scattered belongings, something shifted inside me. It wasn't anger yet. That would come later. It was something colder, more calculating. A voice in the back of my mind that had been sleeping for too long, suddenly wide awake and whispering a single crystal-clear thought. Enough. I gathered what I could carry and headed for the guest room, my temporary exile in my own home. But as I climbed the stairs, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and paused. The woman looking back at me wasn't the doormat Thalia thought she was dealing with. There was something new in my eyes, something that had been dormant for far too long. My daughter had no idea who she was really dealing with, and it was time she found out. After all, there were things about her mother that Thalia had never bothered to learn. Important things, dangerous things. Things that were about to change everything. The guest room felt foreign despite being in my own house. I sat on the narrow twin bed, so different from the king-size bed I'd slept in for 15 years, and stared at the cardboard boxes I'd hastily packed with my most essential belongings. 3 boxes. That's what 35 years of building a life had been reduced to. But as I unpacked my mother's jewelry box, running my fingers over the familiar velvet lining, memories began flooding back. Not the painful ones from this morning, but older ones, darker ones. The ones that reminded me exactly how I'd ended up in this position. It started when Thalia was 7 years old, and her father, my husband Robert, died suddenly of a heart attack. One moment, I was a wife and mother living a comfortable middle-class life, and the next, I was a widow with a 7-year-old daughter, a mortgage, and exactly $1,743 in our checking account. I remember sitting at the kitchen table that first night after the funeral, surrounded by sympathy casseroles and unpaid bills, trying to figure out how to explain to a 7-year-old why Daddy wasn't coming home ever again. Thalia had crawled into my lap, her little face streaked with tears she didn't understand, and asked if we were going to have to move away from our house. "No, baby," I'd whispered into her hair, making a promise I had no idea how to keep. "We're staying right here. Mommy's going to take care of everything." And I had. God help me. I had taken care of everything. Robert's life insurance barely covered the funeral costs. The savings account we'd been building for Thalia's college education evaporated within 6 months, eaten up by daily expenses and the reality that my part-time job at the local library wasn't nearly enough to support us. I remember the night I sat at this very kitchen table, calculator in hand, trying to make the numbers work. They never did. That's when I made the first of many sacrifices that would define the next 28 years of my life. I took a second job cleaning offices at night, then a third job on weekends, doing data entry from home while Thalia slept. I sold my car and bought a used one with cash. I stopped buying new clothes, started shopping at thrift stores, learned to cut Thalia's hair myself to save the $20 salon visits, but I never let her know how hard things were. Never let her see me cry over the bills or worry about where her next pair of shoes would come from. I wanted her childhood to be as normal as possible. Wanted her to feel secure and loved despite losing her father so young. Maybe that was my first mistake. By the time Thalia was in high school, I'd become an expert at hiding our financial struggles. When she wanted to join the cheerleading squad, I worked overtime for 2 months to pay for the uniform and camp fees. When she needed a dress for homecoming, I told her I'd been saving up for it, not mentioning that I'd been eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every day for 3 weeks to afford it. She never asked where the money came from. She just expected it to be there. I thought I was being a good mother. I thought I was protecting her from the harsh realities of our situation. What I was actually doing was raising a daughter who believed that her needs and wants were the center of the universe, and that someone else would always appear to handle the messy details of making those wants become reality. The pattern continued through college. Thalia wanted to go to an expensive private university because all her friends were going there. I took out a second mortgage on the house to pay for it. When she decided to change majors from business to art history in her junior year, extending her graduation date by 2 years, I didn't argue. I just worked more hours and delayed my own retirement savings. When she graduated with a degree she never used and moved back home, temporarily, I told myself it was normal. Lots of young adults struggled to find their footing in the job market. I'd help her for a few months, maybe a year, until she got established. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of watching my daughter sleep until noon, spend her afternoons at yoga classes and coffee shops with friends, and her evenings on dates with men who took her to expensive restaurants she could never afford on her own. 3 years of her treating me like a roommate she was doing a favor by tolerating, rather than the mother who'd sacrificed everything to give her the life she lived. I opened the small notebook where I kept track of household expenses and flipped to the page marked Thalia. The numbers were staggering when you added them up. Car insurance, phone bill, health insurance, grocery money, gas money, spending money for her social activities. In the last 3 years alone, I'd spent over $47,000 supporting her lifestyle. $47,000 that could have gone toward my retirement, or home improvements, or the vacation I hadn't taken in 15 years. But it was the emotional cost that hurt more than the financial one. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being Thalia's mother and become her ATM. She didn't ask about my day or my feelings or my dreams. She didn't notice when I was tired or sick or sad. I existed solely as a resource to be accessed when needed and ignored when not. Like this morning. The casual cruelty with which she'd displaced me from my own bedroom wasn't new behavior. It was the culmination of years of increasingly entitled treatment. I'd just been too busy enabling it to recognize the pattern. My phone buzzed with a text message. Thalia, of course. Need you to pick up some almond milk and that expensive granola I like. Also, Derek is taking me shopping tomorrow, so I'll need the credit card. Thanks. Not a request. Not a please or thank you. Just an expectation that I would comply. The same way someone might expect electricity to work when they flipped a switch. I stared at the message for a long time, then did something I'd never done before. I deleted it without responding. As I sat there in the fading afternoon light, surrounded by boxes in a guest room that was now my permanent residence, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. I'd become a stranger in my own life. I'd spent so long focused on taking care of Thalia that I'd forgotten to take care of myself. I'd been so afraid of her not needing me that I'd allowed her to use me. But there was something else. Something Thalia didn't know about her mother. Something I'd kept hidden for 28 years, buried under the weight of sacrifice and single motherhood. I reached into the bottom of my jewelry box and pulled out a small key I hadn't touched in over a decade. It was the key to a safety deposit box at the bank downtown. A box that contained documents Thalia had never seen, records of investments she knew nothing about, and evidence of a financial safety net I'd been building in secret since she was 8 years old. You see, I'd learned something important in those dark months after Robert died. I'd learned that security didn't come from hoping other people would take care of you. It came from taking care of yourself, quietly and strategically, so that you'd never be helpless again. I'd also learned that sometimes the people you love most will take advantage of your love if you let them. And I'd been letting Thalia take advantage of mine for far too long. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Thalia. Also, Ashley invited me to go to that new spa resort next weekend. Can you cover it? It's only like $500. Only $500. Said like it was pocket change instead of a significant chunk of money that could pay for groceries for a month. I looked at that text for a long time, thinking about the key in my hand and the secrets it unlocked. Thinking about the woman I used to be before I became someone whose only value was her willingness to write checks. Then I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who'd just remembered she had options. Thalia thought she was dealing with a pushover who'd been beaten down by years of widowhood and single motherhood. She thought I was old, tired, and dependent on her company to give my life meaning. She had no idea that the woman she'd just humiliated in the front yard had been planning for this day for longer than she'd been alive. And tomorrow, she was going to start finding out just how wrong she'd been about everything. The next morning, I drove to First National Bank with the small key clutched in my palm. I hadn't been to the safety deposit box in 3 years, not since I'd last updated my will. The young bank teller who escorted me to the vault didn't recognize me. I'd been banking here for over 20 years, but most of the familiar faces had retired or moved on. As the metal door swung open and I pulled out the long, narrow box, my hands trembled slightly. Inside were documents that told the real story of the last 28 years, the story Thalia had never bothered to ask about. I spread the papers across the small table in the private viewing room and took inventory. Stock certificates, bond portfolios, real estate deeds, bank statements from accounts Thalia didn't know existed, insurance policies with beneficiaries that might surprise her. The numbers were staggering, even to me. $1.7 million in various investments. 3 rental properties that had been quietly generating income for over a decade. A trust fund I'd established years ago, originally intended for Thalia's future children, grandchildren I was beginning to doubt I'd ever have a relationship with. But it was the manila folder at the bottom of the box that made my blood run cold. Financial documents I'd forgotten about. Paperwork I'd signed but never fully processed. My hands shook as I opened it and saw Thalia's signature on documents that shouldn't have existed. Power of attorney papers, signed 2 years ago, when I'd had that minor outpatient surgery for my gallbladder. I remembered Thalia insisting I needed someone to handle things, just in case something went wrong. I'd been touched by her sudden concern for my welfare. I'd signed the papers she brought me without reading them carefully, trusting that my daughter had my best interests at heart. I'd been a fool. The power of attorney was far more extensive than I'd realized. It gave Thalia access to my primary checking account, the ability to make medical decisions on my behalf, and most chilling of all, the authority to manage the grantor's financial affairs in the event of mental incapacity. Mental incapacity. The words hit me like a physical blow. I kept reading, my horror growing with each page. There were bank statements from my checking account, the account I thought only I had access to, withdrawals I didn't remember making, transfers to accounts I'd never opened. My monthly Social Security deposits and pension payments were there, but other money was missing. Thousands of dollars that had simply vanished over the past 18 months. My throat went dry as I calculated the amounts. $12,000, $15,000, $23,000. Money that should have been in my account was gone, siphoned off in amounts small enough to avoid triggering any automatic alerts, but large enough to fund Thalia's lifestyle of yoga classes, expensive dinners, and spa weekends. She'd been stealing from me, Systematically, carefully, and legally, thanks to the papers I'd signed without understanding their true scope. But that wasn't the worst part. Tucked behind the bank statements was a printed email that made my stomach turn. It was from Thalia to someone named Derek Stevens, the same Derek she'd been dating for the past few months. "The old lady is getting more suspicious lately," it read. "Asking questions about bills and stuff. Might need to move up our timeline. The house alone is worth at least $400,000, and that doesn't include whatever else she's hiding. She's not as sharp as she used to be. Shouldn't be hard to prove she can't manage her own affairs anymore." My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the paper. I read it again, hoping I'd misunderstood. But the words were clear. Thalia wasn't just stealing my money. She was planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so she could take control of everything. The old lady. That's how she referred to me in private. Not as her mother, not even by name. Just the old lady, whose assets she was systematically planning to acquire. I thought about this morning's humiliation, my belongings scattered across the lawn like garbage. It hadn't been a spontaneous burst of entitlement. It had been calculated. A test to see how much abuse I'd tolerate before fighting back. She was building a case that I was losing my mental faculties, creating evidence of my supposed inability to maintain my living space or make rational decisions. The email continued. "Once we get guardianship, we can sell the house and put her in one of those assisted living places. Split everything 50-50 like we talked about. This time next year, we'll be living in Costa Rica like we planned." Costa Rica. She was planning to take my life savings and move to another country with her boyfriend, a man I'd met exactly 3 times, who'd smiled at me over Sunday dinners while secretly planning to rob me blind. I sat back in the hard plastic chair, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. This wasn't just about money or entitlement. This was about Thalia genuinely believing that I was nothing more than an obstacle between her and the life she felt she deserved. She wasn't just using me, she was actively planning to destroy me. My phone buzzed. A text from Thalia. "Where are you? Need you to sign some papers the lawyer sent over. Something about updating your insurance beneficiaries. Derek says it's really important to get this done ASAP. Insurance beneficiaries. My life insurance policy was worth $500,000, with Thalia as the sole beneficiary." What exactly was she planning to update? I stared at that text for a long time, thinking about the woman who'd given birth to my daughter 35 years ago in this very town. The woman who'd worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over her head. The woman who'd sacrificed her own dreams, her own future, her own happiness to make sure her little girl never went without. That woman had been kind, trusting, willing to believe the best in people, especially her own child. That woman was gone. I gathered up all the documents and put them back in the safety deposit box, except for one folder. The folder containing evidence of Thalia's theft and her plans for my future. That folder came home with me. When I pulled into my driveway, Thalia's car was gone. A note on the kitchen counter explained she'd gone shopping with Derek and wouldn't be back until evening. "Left some insurance papers on your desk," the note read. "Need your signature ASAP. Thanks." I found the papers in my home office, the small room where I'd spent countless nights over the years, managing our finances and planning for our future. The documents were from an insurance company I'd never heard of, requesting signatures to update and consolidate my existing policies. I called my insurance agent, a man I'd worked with for 15 years. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, sounding confused when I described the papers. "I didn't send you anything, and these companies you're describing, I've never heard of them. This sounds like some kind of scam." A scam. Or something worse. I spent the next 2 hours on the phone with my bank, my financial advisor, and my attorney. By the time I was finished, I had a clear picture of what was happening. Thalia had been systematically accessing my accounts using the power of attorney, testing the limits of what she could take without triggering any alarms. The insurance papers were likely an attempt to redirect my life insurance payments, or possibly take out additional policies with herself as beneficiary. She wasn't just planning to rob me. She was planning to profit from my death. As I sat in my home office, surrounded by evidence of my daughter's betrayal, I felt something I'd never experienced before in relation to Thalia. Not disappointment, not hurt, not even anger. Cold, calculating fury. I'd spent 28 years protecting her from the harsh realities of the world. I'd shielded her from financial worry, emotional hardship, and the consequences of her own poor choices. I'd been so focused on being a good mother that I'd forgotten to teach her how to be a good person. But there was something Thalia had overlooked in her careful planning. Something she'd never bothered to learn about the old lady she was so eager to dispose of. I hadn't survived 28 years of single motherhood, built a secret fortune, and raised a daughter by being weak or stupid. I'd done it by being smart, strategic, and when necessary, absolutely ruthless. Thalia thought she was playing chess with someone who didn't know the rules. She was about to discover that her mother had been playing the long game since before she was born. And in this particular game, I held all the important pieces. The front door slammed, announcing Thalia's return. I heard her call out cheerfully, "Mom, did you sign those papers? Derek's waiting in the car." I smiled as I walked toward the living room, the folder of evidence tucked securely under my arm. It was time to teach my daughter the most important lesson of her life. Some people, when you push them far enough, push back harder than you ever imagined possible. I found Thalia in the living room, practically bouncing with excitement as she rifled through shopping bags from expensive stores I couldn't afford to shop at even with my hidden wealth. Her face was flushed with the particular joy that comes from spending someone else's money without permission. "There you are," she said without looking up from her purchases. "Did you sign those insurance papers? Derek's waiting outside, and we're supposed to meet his lawyer in an hour." His lawyer. Not our lawyer, not my lawyer. His lawyer. "I had some questions about those documents," I said carefully, settling into my favorite chair, the one that was apparently destined for the front yard tomorrow if Thalia's room conversion plans continued. "Questions?" Thalia finally looked at me, and I saw a flash of something in her eyes. Impatience, annoyance, maybe even fear, though she hid it quickly. "What kind of questions?" Derek explained everything. It's just routine updating stuff. When did Derek become an expert on my insurance policies? The question hung in the air between us. Thalia's perfectly manicured fingers stopped moving through her shopping bags, and for just a moment, her mask slipped. I saw the calculation behind her eyes, the quick mental scramble to find an acceptable explanation. "He works in finance," she said finally. "He knows about this stuff. He's just trying to help." How thoughtful of him. I kept my voice light, conversational. "Tell me, Thalia, in all these months of Derek helping with my finances, did you two discuss anything else? My property values, perhaps? My other investments?" She was staring at me now, her shopping excitement completely forgotten. "Mom, what are you getting at? You're being really weird." Weird. Not suspicious, not smart, not careful with my money. Weird. "I'm getting at the fact that I went to the bank today," I said, opening the folder I'd been carrying. "I accessed my safety deposit box for the first time in 3 years. Very educational experience." The color drained from Thalia's face so quickly I thought she might faint. She sank down onto the couch, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "I found some interesting documents," I continued, pulling out the bank statements showing the unauthorized withdrawals. Money that's been leaving my accounts in small amounts over the past 18 months. Money I didn't authorize, didn't spend, and didn't know was missing. "Mom, I can explain." "I'm sure you can. You've always been creative with explanations." I set the statements on the coffee table between us, each page a testament to months of systematic theft. $23,000, Thalia. That's how much you've stolen from me using that power of attorney you convinced me to sign. She was crying now, or at least making crying sounds. No actual tears, I noticed, just the kind of performance she'd perfected as a child when she was caught doing something she shouldn't. "I wasn't stealing," she said, her voice taking on that wheedling tone I remembered from her teenage years. "I was just borrowing. I was going to pay it back once I got on my feet financially. Borrowing requires permission. Taking money without permission is called theft." I pulled out the printed email. But theft is the least of your crimes, isn't it? Her eyes widened when she saw the email, and this time the fear was unmistakable. Where did you get that? Does it matter? What matters is that I have it, along with several others from the same account. I hadn't found other emails, but Thalia didn't need to know that. The guilty always assume you know more than you actually do. That's not what it looks like, she said desperately. We were just planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could steal my house and put me in a nursing home while you moved to Costa Rica with my money. I spoke calmly like I was discussing the weather. Yes, I read the whole conversation. Thalia's face went through a series of expressions: denial, anger, calculation, and finally something that chilled me to the bone: cold acceptance. The mask was off completely now, and I was seeing my daughter's true face for the first time in years. So what? She said, her voice flat and emotionless. So what if we were planning that? You're 65 years old, Mom. You're not getting any younger. At least this way you'd be taken care of in a nice facility instead of deteriorating alone in this house. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Taken care of with whose money, Thalia? After you've stolen everything I've worked for? She shrugged, like my life savings were pocket change. You can't take it with you when you die. At least this way it would go to someone who could actually enjoy it. Someone like Derek? Derek and I have plans. Real plans for our future. We're not going to waste our lives working dead-end jobs and living in the same boring house for 30 years. Her voice was getting stronger now, more confident. She was warming to her theme. We deserve better than this. Deserve. There was that word again. And what exactly have you done to deserve my life savings? I've put up with you for 35 years, she said, her eyes flashing with genuine anger now. Do you have any idea what it's been like having you as a mother? Always working, always tired, always worried about money, never any fun, never any adventure, just bills and responsibility and guilt trips about being grateful for what we had. I stared at her, genuinely stunned. I worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat after your father died. I sacrificed everything to make sure you had a stable home and could go to college. Sacrificed, she interrupted, rolling her eyes. That's all you ever talk about. Your sacrifices, your hard work, your struggles. Did it ever occur to you that maybe I didn't ask for any of that? Maybe I would have preferred a mother who was actually present instead of always off working or worrying. The words hit like physical blows. Every choice I'd made, every sacrifice I'd endured, every sleepless night I'd spent worrying about her future, all of it dismissed as selfishness, disguised as martyrdom. You're right, I said quietly. You didn't ask for any of that, but you certainly enjoyed the benefits, didn't you? The private school, the college education, the car, the clothes, the house you've been living in rent-free for 3 years. I never asked you to pay for any of those things. No, you just expected them to appear, like magic. I stood up, gathering the documents. Well, the magic show is over, Thalia. Something in my tone must have warned her that the conversation had shifted into dangerous territory. She leaned forward, her expression shifting back to the manipulative sweetness she used when she wanted something. Mom, look, maybe we both said some things we didn't mean. We can work this out. We're family. Are we? I asked, genuinely curious. Because family members don't usually plot to rob each other and abandon each other in nursing homes. I would never abandon you. I was just... Derek gets these ideas sometimes, and I go along with them because you're weak. The words came out colder than I'd intended, but I didn't regret them. You're weak, and you're greedy, and you've spent so many years having other people solve your problems that you don't even know how to take responsibility for your own choices anymore. Her face crumpled, but I wasn't fooled. I'd seen this performance too many times before. I'll pay it back, she said, her voice small and childlike. All of it. I'll get a job, a real job, and I'll pay back every penny I took. We can forget about Derek's stupid plans and just go back to the way things were. The way things were, where I worked to support her lifestyle while she treated me like an inconvenient roommate. where she stole from me while I pretended not to notice the money disappearing, where she made plans to dispose of me while I continued to enable her delusions. No, I said simply. No, no. We can't go back to the way things were, because the way things were was destroying both of us. I walked toward the front door, then turned back to look at her. You have until tomorrow morning to decide what kind of person you want to be, Thalia. The kind who faces consequences for her actions, or the kind who doubles down on her mistakes. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm going to spend this evening making some phone calls. To my lawyer, to my financial advisor, and to the police. I watched the blood drain from her face again. What happens next depends entirely on what you choose to do between now and tomorrow morning. Mom, please. My name is Nellie, I said, my voice as cold as January wind. You lost the right to call me Mom when you started planning my funeral. I walked out of my own house, leaving Thalia sitting among her expensive shopping bags, finally understanding that the game had changed completely. For the first time in 35 years, she was going to have to figure out how to solve her own problems. And for the first time in 35 years, I was going to stop making excuses for someone who saw my love as weakness to be exploited. I spent that evening at a hotel downtown, making the most important phone calls of my life. My lawyer, Patricia Hendricks, had been handling my legal affairs for over a decade. She listened without interruption as I explained the situation, then let out a low whistle. Nellie, this is serious. What Thalia's done with the power of attorney could be considered elder abuse. The financial exploitation alone could result in felony charges. Her voice was grim. How do you want to handle this? I want to give her one chance to do the right thing, I said, staring out the hotel window at the city lights below. One chance to come clean and start making amends. If she takes it, we handle this privately. If she doesn't, we throw the book at her. Patricia's tone left no room for argument. I'll have everything prepared either way. What's your timeline? 24 hours. The next morning, I returned home to find Thalia pacing the living room like a caged animal. She'd been crying, real tears this time, judging by the puffy eyes and blotchy complexion. Derek was nowhere to be seen, which told me everything I needed to know about his loyalty when things got difficult. Mom, she said the moment I walked through the door. Thank God you're back. I've been thinking all night, and you're right, about everything. I was wrong, and I want to fix this. I said nothing, just hung my coat in the closet and walked to the kitchen to make coffee. She followed me, hovering nearby like she used to as a child when she was in trouble. I broke up with Derek, she continued, her words tumbling over each other in her desperation to convince me of her sincerity. I told him his plans were crazy and that I would never do anything to hurt you. He got angry and left, but I don't care. You're more important than any guy. I poured water into the coffee maker, still silent. Thalia's voice was getting higher, more frantic. I know I took money from your account, and I know it was wrong. I'll pay it all back, I swear. I'll get a job today, this morning even. I'll work 2 jobs if I have to. Whatever it takes to make this right. The coffee maker gurgled to life. I turned to face my daughter, really looking at her. She was 35 years old, but standing there in my kitchen, wringing her hands and promising to change, she looked like a child who'd been caught stealing candy. How? I asked simply. How what? How will you pay back $23,000? You have no job, no savings, no assets of your own. You've never held a position for longer than 6 months in your entire adult life. I kept my voice neutral, curious rather than accusatory. Walk me through your plan. She blinked, clearly not having thought that far ahead. I'll figure something out. There are lots of jobs out there. What kind of jobs? I don't know. Retail, maybe? Or I could do the yoga instructor certification I've been talking about. I'm good at yoga. Retail jobs typically pay minimum wage, I said, leaning against the counter. Even if you worked full-time at $8 an hour, that's about $16,000 a year before taxes. After taxes, rent, food, and basic expenses, you might have $50 a month left over. At that rate, it would take you approximately 38 years to pay me back. The color drained from her face as the mathematics of her situation became clear. Or, I continued, you could become a yoga instructor. Most studios pay between $25 and $75 per class. If you taught one class a day, 7 days a week, at the top rate, that's about $27,000 a year. Better, but still not enough to pay me back and support yourself. I could live here while I'm paying you back, she said desperately. I wouldn't charge you rent or anything. You haven't been paying rent for 3 years. That's another $48,000 you owe me in back rent alone. Her mouth fell open. You want me to pay rent? I'm your daughter. And there it was. The entitlement that had been festering for decades, finally exposed in all its ugly glory. Even now, even after being caught stealing from me, she still believed she deserved to live in my house for free. Yes, Thalia. You're my daughter, not my dependent child. My adult daughter who's been taking advantage of my generosity for years. I poured myself a cup of coffee, inhaling the familiar aroma. And that brings us to the real question. What question? Are you actually sorry for what you did? Or are you just sorry you got caught? She opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand to stop her. Think carefully before you answer, because your response is going to determine what happens next. For a long moment, the kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I watched Thalia's face go through a series of expressions as she processed my question. I could almost see the wheels turning in her head, calculating which answer would get her what she wanted. That calculation told me everything I needed to know. I'm sorry for what I did, she said finally, but her eyes didn't meet mine. I know it was wrong to take your money. I know it was wrong to plan those other things with Derek. I was confused and scared about my future, and I made terrible choices. It was a good answer, a perfect answer, actually. Exactly what someone would say if they were truly repentant and wanted to make amends. It was also complete bullshit. I believe you, I said, and watched relief flood her features. Which is why I've decided to give you a chance to prove your sincerity. Thank you, Mom. Thank you so much. You won't regret this, I promise. I've arranged for a family meeting tonight, I continued, pulling out my phone. 7 o'clock. I've invited some people who care about our family's welfare to witness your apology and your commitment to making things right. A family meeting? Uncertainty crept into her voice. What people? Your Aunt Sarah, for one. She's driving down from Portland this afternoon. Sarah was my sister, a retired high school principal who'd never been fooled by Thalia's charm. And my lawyer, Patricia, and Detective Morrison from the county sheriff's office. Thalia went very still. A detective? Why do we need a detective at a family meeting? Because what you did is a crime, sweetheart. Elder abuse, financial exploitation, conspiracy to commit fraud. The detective is here to witness your confession and your commitment to restitution. If you're sincere about making amends, you shouldn't have any problem admitting what you did in front of people who matter. But if I confess to a police officer, you'll be taking responsibility for your actions like an adult. I set down my coffee cup and looked directly into her eyes. Unless, of course, you're not actually sorry. Unless you're just looking for a way to wiggle out of consequences again. The mask was starting to slip. I could see the real Thalia underneath, the one who was calculating whether she could somehow talk her way out of this new trap. What if I don't want to do this meeting? She asked, her voice smaller now. Then I'll assume you're not sincere about making amends, and I'll proceed with pressing full criminal charges tomorrow morning. I shrugged like it didn't matter to me either way. Your choice. That's not fair. You're forcing me to confess to a crime. I'm not forcing you to do anything. I'm giving you an opportunity to take responsibility for what you've already done. I walked toward the living room, then turned back. The meeting is at 7 o'clock. If you're here, I'll assume you want to make things right. If you're not here, I'll assume you've chosen to handle this through the legal system instead. And if I do confess, what happens then? Then we work out a realistic plan for you to pay restitution and rebuild our relationship. I paused. And you'll need to find somewhere else to live. Tonight. Tonight? But where am I supposed to go? That's not my problem anymore, Thalia. You're 35 years old. It's time you figured out how to solve your own problems. I left her standing in the kitchen, her face a mask of panic and calculation. I knew exactly what she was thinking. She was weighing her options, trying to figure out which choice would cause her the least discomfort. What she didn't understand was that all her options now led to discomfort. The only question was whether she'd choose the discomfort of taking responsibility or the discomfort of facing criminal charges. I spent the rest of the day preparing for the evening's meeting. I arranged chairs in the living room, made sure I had copies of all the relevant documents, and even put together a small tray of cookies and coffee for my guests. If Thalia was going to confess to stealing from her own mother, it might as well be in a civilized setting. At 6:30, Aunt Sarah arrived, her expression grim. She'd never approved of how I'd spoiled Thalia, and she'd been waiting for years for this reckoning. "Where is she?" Sarah asked, settling into her chair with the authority of someone who'd spent 40 years dealing with difficult teenagers. "Upstairs. Getting ready, I assume." At 6:45, Patricia arrived with Detective Morrison, a kind-faced woman in her 50s who specialized in elder abuse cases. We made small talk while we waited, but my eyes kept drifting to the staircase. At 7 o'clock exactly, Thalia appeared at the top of the stairs. She'd changed into a conservative black dress and had styled her hair in a simple bun. She looked younger somehow, more vulnerable. It was a carefully crafted appearance designed to generate sympathy. But as she descended the stairs and saw the assembled group waiting for her, her step faltered. This wasn't the casual family chat she'd been hoping for. This was a formal proceeding with witnesses and legal implications. "Good evening, Thalia," Detective Morrison said gently. "Your mother tells me you have something you'd like to share with us." Thalia looked at me, her eyes pleading for some kind of escape. But I'd learned something important over the past 48 hours. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to save them from themselves. Thalia stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, her carefully composed facade cracking as she took in the formal arrangement of chairs, the serious faces, the detective's badge gleaming under the living room lights. This wasn't the casual family discussion she'd imagined. This was a tribunal. She began, then stopped, her eyes darting between me and the exit. I could see her mind racing, calculating whether she could simply walk out and pretend none of this was happening. "Please have a seat," Detective Morrison said gently, gesturing to the chair I'd placed directly across from the assembled group. "I understand you have something you'd like to tell us about some financial irregularities?" Thalia remained standing, her hands clenched at her sides. "I don't have to do this," she said, her voice higher than usual. "I don't have to confess to anything." "You're absolutely right," I said calmly. "You don't have to do anything. You can walk out that door right now if you choose." "And if I do?" "Then tomorrow morning, Detective Morrison will be back with a warrant for your arrest on charges of elder abuse and financial exploitation." I kept my voice even, matter of fact. "Your choice." For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The clock Thalia had once suggested I sell because it was old-fashioned and probably worth something. Slowly, she walked to the designated chair and sat down, her posture rigid with resentment. "Now then," Detective Morrison said, pulling out a small recorder. "I'm going to record this conversation for accuracy. Mrs. Patterson, you've alleged that your daughter has been accessing your bank accounts without permission. Is that correct?" "Yes." I handed over the bank statements. $23,000 over 18 months, taken in small amounts to avoid detection. Detective Morrison examined the documents, then looked at Thalia. "Miss Patterson, did you take this money from your mother's accounts?" Thalia's jaw worked silently for several seconds. I could see her weighing her options, trying to find some way to minimize the damage. Finally, she spoke. "Yes, but it wasn't stealing. I had power of attorney. Technically, I was authorized to access her accounts." "For what purpose?" the detective asked. "For her care and welfare," Thalia said, gaining confidence. The power of attorney specifically states that I can manage her financial affairs. And you felt that yoga classes and spa weekends constituted your mother's care and welfare? The question hung in the air like a blade. Thalia's cheeks flushed red. I was stressed. Caring for an aging parent is difficult. I needed to maintain my own mental health in order to be there for her. Aunt Sarah made a sound of disgust. Caring for her? You've been living in her house rent-free for 3 years while she pays all your bills. That's between my mother and me, Thalia snapped, some of her old arrogance returning. Actually, Patricia interjected, it's between you and the criminal justice system now. The power of attorney you're referencing was obtained under false pretenses and used beyond its intended scope. That constitutes fraud. I never lied about anything. You told your mother the power of attorney was a temporary measure for her minor surgery, I said quietly. You didn't mention it would give you permanent access to my accounts or the authority to have me declared mentally incompetent. Thalia went very still. Who told you about that? You did. In your emails to Derek. I pulled out the printed messages. The ones where you discussed timeline for taking control of my assets and moving to Costa Rica. Detective Morrison read the emails, her expression growing colder with each line. Miss Patterson, these messages suggest you were planning to defraud your mother of her property and have her involuntarily committed to a care facility. Is that accurate? No, that was Derek's idea. I never would have gone through with it. But you didn't report his criminal intentions to authorities, the detective pointed out. Instead, you continued the relationship and the planning. That makes you a co-conspirator. Thalia was breathing heavily now, her composure completely shattered. You don't understand. I've given up everything for her. My entire adult life has been about taking care of her needs. I deserve something for that. What exactly have you given up? Aunt Sarah asked, her voice sharp with decades of suppressed frustration. What sacrifices have you made? I live here. I keep her company. I make sure she's not alone. You live here rent-free, I corrected. You eat food I buy, drive a car I pay for, wear clothes I purchase. And far from keeping me company, you barely speak to me unless you need something. That's not true. When was the last time you asked how I was feeling? When was the last time you showed interest in my work, my friends, my life? I waited, but she had no answer. You don't even know what I do for a living, do you? Thalia's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. In all her calculations about my worth as a financial resource, she'd never bothered to learn the basic facts about my life. You think I'm just some lonely old woman who should be grateful for your presence, I continued. But the truth is, I've been lonelier living with you than I ever was living alone. At least when I was alone, I didn't have to watch someone I love treat me with contempt. I don't treat you with contempt. Yesterday morning, you threw my belongings onto the front lawn and told me to clean up the trash, I said quietly. You called my possessions, including my mother's china and our family photos, junk that embarrassed you in front of your friends. Tears were streaming down Thalia's face now, but I felt no urge to comfort her. These weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of self-pity, shed because she was finally facing consequences for her actions. Miss Patterson, Detective Morrison said, I need you to clearly state whether you took money from your mother's accounts without her knowledge or permission. Yes, Thalia whispered. And did you plan with Derek Stevens to have your mother declared mentally incompetent in order to gain control of her assets? A longer pause. Yes. Did you intend to place your mother in a care facility against her will? It wasn't. It wouldn't have been against her will. We would have convinced her it was for the best. Through deception and manipulation? Yes. Detective Morrison clicked off the recorder. Miss Patterson, you're under arrest for elder abuse and financial exploitation. What? Thalia shot to her feet. But you said if I confessed. I said if you confessed, we'd work out a plan for restitution, I corrected. I never said there wouldn't be legal consequences. As Detective Morrison read Thalia her rights, my daughter turned to me with an expression of pure hatred. You did this, she hissed. You set me up. You planned this whole thing." "Yes," I said simply. "I did. But I'm your daughter. How could you have your own daughter arrested?" I looked at this woman I'd given birth to 35 years ago, this stranger who'd been systematically planning to destroy my life while living off my generosity. For the first time in decades, I felt no guilt, no obligation, no desperate need to fix her problems. "You stopped being my daughter the moment you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive," I said quietly. They led her away in handcuffs, still protesting, still demanding that I fix this latest mess she'd created. But I remained seated in my living room, feeling lighter than I had in years. 6 months later, I was sitting in a different living room, my new living room, in a cozy condominium downtown that was just the right size for one person. I'd sold the house where I'd raised Thalia and sacrificed so much of myself in the process. The new owners were a young couple with a baby on the way. They'd been thrilled with the spacious rooms and established garden. Thalia had pled guilty to reduced charges and received 2 years probation, plus an order to pay full restitution. She was working 2 minimum-wage jobs and living in a studio apartment across town. We hadn't spoken since the trial. I'd heard through Aunt Sarah that Thalia was telling people I was a cruel, vindictive mother who'd destroyed her life out of spite. Let her tell that story if it helped her sleep at night. I knew the truth. The truth was that I'd spent 35 years enabling someone who saw my love as weakness to be exploited. I'd confused being a good mother with being a doormat, confused sacrifice with self-destruction. But I'd also spent the last 6 months rediscovering who I was when I wasn't defined by someone else's needs and demands. I'd taken art classes, joined a book club, traveled to places I'd only dreamed of seeing. I'd made new friends who valued my company for itself, not for what I could provide them. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. "Hello? Mom?" Thalia's voice was small, uncertain. "It's me." I said nothing, waiting. I've been thinking about things, about what happened, and I wanted to call and apologize. "I see. I know I hurt you. I know what I did was wrong, and I was wondering if maybe we could, if you'd be willing to try again, to rebuild our relationship." I looked around my peaceful living room, at the books I'd been reading, the art supplies I'd been experimenting with, the photos from my recent trip to Ireland. I thought about the woman I'd become when I stopped trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. "Thalia," I said gently, "I forgive you. I truly do, but I don't trust you. And I don't think I ever will again. But I've changed. I've learned my lesson. I have a job now. I'm supporting myself. I'm glad to hear that. I genuinely hope you build a good life for yourself. But you won't give me another chance?" I was quiet for a long moment, thinking about chances. I'd given Thalia thousands of chances over the years. Chances to grow up, chances to take responsibility, chances to treat me with basic respect. She'd squandered every one. "I gave you 35 years of chances," I said finally. "I'm 66 years old now, Thalia. I don't have another 35 years to give." "So that's it? You're just cutting me off forever?" "I'm choosing to live the rest of my life surrounded by people who value me for who I am, not what I can give them." I paused. "I hope someday you understand the difference." I hung up before she could respond, then turned off my phone. Outside my window, the city was coming alive with evening lights. Somewhere out there, people were struggling with the same impossible choices I'd faced. Parents wondering if they were helping or enabling. Children taking for granted the love that had shaped their entire lives. I couldn't save any of them, just like I couldn't save Thalia, but I could save myself. And for the first time in 35 years, that felt like enough. I picked up my latest book and settled back into my comfortable chair. My chair, in my space, surrounded by my peace. The woman who'd once scattered my belongings across the front yard like trash was paying for her own belongings now, working for her own food, solving her own problems. It had taken 66 years, but I'd finally learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest act of love is letting someone face the consequences of their choices. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the freedom to walk away from people who mistake your kindness for weakness. I opened my book and began to read, completely alone and completely at peace. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites. And they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.